The film revolves around a boy named Jimmy who is starting high school. On the first day of school, he gets bullied at lunch along with his new friend Alan, and even in class others call him out for being fat. After lunch, when Jimmy goes to class, his teacher discusses the syllabus with them and also advises them to keep a journal. As a part of their course, she wants her students to write about their daily activities and also about what they feel on a daily basis in their journals. When the class ends, Jimmy joins the football team for practice, and even there he is insecure about his body. After school, when he goes home, his parents ask him about his day and new friends, but he does not pay any attention to them because he doesn't have any new friends. After his meal, he goes to his room and writes about his day in his journal. The next day, he goes to school and notices that he does not know any person there except his sister Jessica and an old classmate, and writes about this in his journal. The next day at breakfast, Jessica makes fun of his weight and refuses to let him ride with her to school in her car. So Jimmy has to take the bus, and this gives the bullies a chance to make fun of him once again. When he reaches school, his new class fellow named Sable talks to him. She seems kind, and this makes Jimmy comfortable around her, so he tells her about the last class that she missed. He also tells her about the journal they have to write. After school, Jimmy is hanging out with his friend Paul at his house when they hear the news of a missing teenager. Paul tries to convince Jimmy to find the lost girl since it'll make them famous, but Jimmy refuses to go on this hunt. That night, he once again writes about his day in the journal before going to bed, but then he starts to think that journal writing is useless since there's nothing special about his life. The next morning, in his football class, one of the team members named Rob makes fun of his physique, and the whole team joins in to laugh at him. After that, in science class, Jimmy's class fellow takes his homework so she can correct hers. When the teacher asks him about his homework, he lies that he does not have it on him just to protect that girl, but she returns the favor by bullying him. After school, the teacher sends a note to Jimmy's mother about this situation, and she schools him. But Jimmy tells her that he just protected his friend, after which his mom advises him to make better friends. After a few days, Jimmy sees an advertisement on television about losing weight. The same day, he goes to the physician for his yearly checkup, and the physician tells him that he is clearly overweight. Jimmy tells him about the bullying he faces at school, on which the doctor advises him to lose weight to make things right. Jimmy's obesity annoys him, and when he comes back home from the hospital, he gets mad at everything, but his father calms him down. That night, Jimmy researches the side effects of obesity and also learns about its medical disadvantages. The next day at school after class, Jimmy goes to a rally with other students but feels alone. After school, he writes in his journal about how he feels about being a victim of bullying and being alone because of his physique. After writing in the journal, he makes an activity chart with the intention of losing weight and starts his weight loss journey the very next morning by jogging. In the afternoon, while playing a video game, he shares with Paul that he's interested in Sable. The next morning at school, Jimmy talks to Sable about that missing girl and then asks her if she wants to watch a football match with him. At first, Sable shows zero interest, but then she agrees and goes with him and Alan. The days go by, and Jimmy continues his exercise and keeps writing everything in his journal. After some days at breakfast, Jimmy's father asks him about his jogging routine. Jimmy tells him that he has already lost 14 pounds of weight, at which his father praises him. On the same day in the science class at school, the teacher gives the students a project to make individually or with the help of a partner. At lunch after class, one of the boys from his class tells Jimmy that the football coach needs a new recruit, so he takes Jimmy with him. When they reach the locker room, the boy pranks Jimmy alongside his friends. Jimmy gets hurt, and after school, his coach sees him sitting alone in the locker room, so he talks to the kid and encourages him. The next day, Sable gets into a fight with that boy and insults him in front of the whole class because of Jimmy. That evening, Jimmy meets Paul and says she wants to invite Sable to go to church with them. They also talk about Paul being suspended from school. The next day in class, Sable asks Jimmy about going to church before him, which pleases him a lot. That evening, Paul again talks about that missing girl and even makes a plan to find that girl's killer with Jimmy's help. Jimmy agrees, and Paul asks him for his sister's photos to complete his plan. On Wednesday, Sable joins Jimmy for church, and before going to church, she plays foosball with him and Paul. During the game, Sable suddenly folds her sleeves, and the boys notice some cuts on her arms. After realizing what she revealed, she hides them immediately. After foosball, Paul leaves and Jimmy tries to ask Sable about her scars, but his parents join them for the service. After coming back, Jimmy again writes about all the problems caused by his weight in his journal. Later on, Paul calls him and says that he posted Jessica's photos on an app after some editing. He tells Jimmy that when someone tries to approach her, they will catch him and declare him the killer. The day when Jimmy goes to school, he sees Jessica's posters everywhere and realizes the flaws in Paul's idea. After coming back, he asks Paul to remove the photos, but Paul tells him that someone wants to meet his sister. The next day in class, his teacher informs the class that they have to perform a play. Sable quickly takes the lead role and asks Jimmy to take the male lead role, but he ignores her, and this makes Sable mad. After class, he again invites Sable to church, but she also ignores him and leaves. After school, Jimmy and Paul go to the restaurant to catch the person who replied to Jessica's photos, but suddenly she comes there along with some of her fellows. Jimmy and Paul hide from her in the bathroom until she leaves. After a while, Jimmy goes home and sees that his parents are angry. They ask Jimmy about coming late and also about his bike, which Jessica noticed outside the restaurant, but Jimmy refuses to admit any guilt and leaves to finish his homework. He goes to his room and writes about his day in his journal. Meanwhile, his father comes to his room and asks him about his exercise. Jimmy tells his dad about his weight loss and also asks for permission to stay at Paul's house, and luckily his dad allows him to go. At night, Jimmy goes to Paul's house, but when they start playing a video game, Paul's father comes and makes fun of them. Paul decides to leave his house due to his drunk father's behavior and goes to a party with Jimmy. Jimmy tries to stop him at first, but eventually agrees to go with him. At the party, he sees his class fellows, and they make fun of him again, so the duo comes back home and falls asleep. In the morning, Jimmy wakes up due to some noises and sees Paul's father beating him. Jimmy tries to stop the unhinged guy, so he leaves after making fun of Jimmy's weight. Meanwhile, Jimmy's father comes to pick him, and this is when Jimmy tells him about Paul's father. Jimmy goes to school the next day and meets Sable there. She asks him why he rejected the lead role. So Jimmy tells her that he does not want to get bullied again. He immediately asks her about the cuts on her arms, and Sable tells him about her problems. She says that there are a ton of problems other than being overweight, and she's just dealing with one of them. After school, Jimmy spends some time studying. At dinner, his father receives a call, and they come to know that Paul ran away from home. This makes Jimmy worried because Paul is his best friend. The next day at school, Rob comes to Jimmy and tells him that he needs help with his mathematics test preparation. Jimmy agrees to help him, and while studying, Rob loses his cool, but Jimmy calms him down, and they get back to solving problems. The next morning, when Jimmy comes back home after jogging, his father tells him that Paul got into an accident, which makes Jimmy really sad. At school, Rob again asks for his help, but at lunch, he simply refuses to talk to Jimmy. After school, Jimmy goes to church with his family, and then Sable also joins them. There, she talks to Jimmy about Paul, and then tells Jimmy how she feels about him. In the evening, Jessica talks to Jimmy about her photos this time. Jimmy apologizes to her, and she forgives him. The next day, Rob once again comes to Jimmy to ask for his help with homework, and Jimmy agrees instantly. After that, in class, Sable performs the lead role in the play, and a boy tries to accompany her, but he fails to do it properly. So she convinces Jimmy to play that role, and he tries it and gives a good performance. After class in the locker room, a boy from class starts a fight with Jimmy for playing that role with Sable, but Rob comes there and saves him. When Jimmy goes home after school, his parents tell him about Paul's hospital admission and that he can meet his friend tomorrow. So the next day, Jimmy goes to hospital and meets Paul, and they both talk about his accident. He also tells Paul about the murderer of that missing girl which they tried to find. Jimmy is clearly glad to see his friend back, and this makes Paul happy. After that, in school, Jimmy confesses his love for Sable in the cafeteria, and everyone appreciates him. Jimmy and Rob become friends, and Rob starts helping him in exercising. Jimmy's life changes with his weight loss journey, and he starts admiring himself and writes all about it in his journal. The film ends with him handing over the journal to his teacher.